Hi, my name is Cheryl Abbate. I am a graduate student from Marquette University, and I will be presenting my paper titled Non-Human Animals, Not Necessarily Saints or Sinners. This, as you'll see, is an analysis of higher-order thought attribution to non-human animals and its implications regarding moral agency. Now, what I've done with this paper is I'm investigating if higher-order thought theories of consciousness turn out to be the correct view on consciousness, how then do we go about ensuring that non-human animals will be fully covered or will be said to meet these standards on a higher-order thought theory without leading to absurd consequences or maybe far-out consequences that non-human animals are moral agency. So it's trying to strike a balance to say between allowing non-human animals to meet the realm or the requirements of high-order thought without maybe pushing too far and making attributions to non-human animals such as moral agency that aren't true of them. So the first question to address before exploring this topic is why the topic of consciousness is critical to the animal ethics debate. Well, being able to have conscious mental states is absolutely critical if we're going to talk about a being who is morally considerable, directly morally considerable, under kind of a sentience-based theory approach to moral considerability. So having a conscious mental state entails that a being has phenomenal properties or subjective feels. And it's only these creatures that have these sorts of mental states that they can experience, that they can subjectively feel, are beings that can be said to be morally considerable, that is, moral patients. Now, there is a distinction that is made by individuals such as Dennett or Carruthers that claim that there's something to be said about mental states in general and conscious mental states, and that not all mental states a being has are conscious mental states. And this is where an animal ethicist might get into trouble if they're assuming that, well, because non-human animals have mental states, they're therefore morally considerable. Rather, we need to go to the further step and make sure we can demonstrate that mental states that animals possess are indeed conscious, and we have to be able to prove this even under a higher order thought theory of consciousness, which maintains that, well, a mental state being conscious is dependent on the being being able to have some higher order thoughts about that mental state. So within theories of consciousness, we can separate these theories into basically two main categories. We have the first order representational theories, which maintain that mental states are conscious because the states themselves make the subject aware of the external environment. So these are theories that we see endorsed by Dretske and Tai. And then the other major category is higher order representational theories, which maintain that a mental state is conscious only when there's a higher order representation of the mental state. And within this category of higher order thought, higher order representational theories, we have two subcategories, so higher order perception and higher order thought. And since higher order thought, as you can see on this slide, it requires that for a mental state to be conscious, you actually have to have, the experiencer has to have a further higher thought about that respective mental state. And this is something endorsed by Carruthers or Davidson, and it is definitely the theory that requires the most conceptually out of a being if we're going to say that that being is conscious. So again, that is our starting point with this paper, is responding to the theory that is going to pose the most problems when arguing that non-human animals are indeed conscious beings. So if higher order thought theories of consciousness turn out to be the correct view on consciousness, what are the consequences for non-human animals? Well, as mentioned before, higher order thought theories of consciousness seem to impose a great burden of conceptual ability on non-human animals. Thus, we're basically presented with two options. The first option is that we could just deny that non-human animals are conscious, and this is the route that Davidson and Carruthers maintain. Basically, the claim is that, well, non-human animals don't have the conceptual capacity to formulate higher order thoughts about their own mental states, therefore they just don't have any mental states that are conscious. That obviously is not something that's going to sit well with an animal ethicist, thus we could move to the second option, which claims that non-human animals actually have a greater conceptual capacity that we have traditionally credited them with. So this is what non-human animal ethicists will attempt to do in order to preserve the idea that non-human animals are conscious beings, or beings that are entitled to direct moral consideration because of the fact that they do have subjective feels, they have experiences that affect them negatively or positively. And if higher order thought theory turns out to be correct, there's basically 3 routes that are taken to show or demonstrate that non-human animals are indeed conscious even under higher order thought theory. And that's either demonstrating that non-human animals have the ability for metacognition, the ability to mind read, or they have language, all which can entail that non-human animals do indeed have higher order thoughts. Now, although this all sounds great, that we would ensure that non-human animals are in fact conscious, even under the most difficult, taxing theory of consciousness, there is a problem that remains, and that's the problem of maybe attributing too much to non-human animals, and specifically we run the risk of attributing moral agency to non-human animals when we start to talk about higher order thought in non-human animals. But the solution that I'm trying to demonstrate in this paper is that we can illustrate that non-human animals possess higher order thought without attributing to them the most sophisticated human-like conceptual capacities that entail moral agency. And this is going to be because I argue that moral agency, to be agents that are held morally accountable for their actions, the beings must meet 2 requirements. First, the capacity to form beliefs or thoughts about the mental states of others, and this is known as mind reading. And furthermore, beyond this, the beings that are moral agents must be able to possess moral thought, third order intentionality, which is a thought about the rightness or wrongness of affecting another, including his or her own mental states. Now, if you look at the argument on this slide, basically there are 2 things going on. First, I'm arguing that, well, I'm putting forth again the necessary conditions of being a moral agent. That's namely that in order to be a moral agent, one has to be able to mind read and also to possess moral thought, third order intentionality. The second part of this argument is to show, well, what exactly is required if one is to have higher order thought. And some of the arguments put forth in the literature purport to show that the only thing what is sufficient for higher order thought is metacognition, and perhaps non-human animals only possess metacognition, which entails that they have higher order thought, but it by no means entails that non-human animals are moral agents, because nothing about having metacognition entails that non-human animals can even mind read. So it fails on the account that metacognition does not entail mind reading. Now I'm going to talk about something briefly, and that I talked about in my paper, that it does illustrate that non-human animals do in fact have metacognition, or at least certain non-human animals do. So this is a study that it's a self-confident study that was conducted by Smith and Washburn in 2005. And in the study, monkeys learned to control a joystick to choose answers in discrimination tests about visual patterns on a computer screen. When they selected the correct answer, they received treats, and when they chose incorrectly, they received timeouts, which they dreaded. Now, what was unique to this study was that there's a pass option, so a monkey could essentially move on if the test was too difficult. And moving on and selecting the pass button, they didn't receive a treat, but at the same time, they didn't receive a timeout. So the monkeys here were said to demonstrate capacity for metacognition when they selected the pass button. That is, they were said to be able to assess their own level of confidence and understand when they were uncertain. And so this understanding of one's own own uncertainty is an instance of metacognition or higher order thought, yet nothing about this instance of metacognition requires that the monkey has a higher order thought about another being's mental state. So again, this example is just to reinforce the idea that metacognition is sufficient for higher order thought. And quite evidently, there are numerous cases we could make examples to show that non-human animals do in fact demonstrate the capacity for metacognition, and that these examples are relatively uncontroversial. So we can demonstrate the capacity for metacognition without then making the jump that non-human animals have the capacity to be able to engage in mind reading, which is actually required, one of the conditions for moral agency. So, theory of mind, also known as mind reading, is defined by Lurs as, quote, the ability to predict, explain, or understand the behavior of other subjects by means of attributing mental states to them, end quote, and this requires, at the very least, having higher order thoughts about another's mental states. So this right here, quite evidently, is a condition for being a moral agent. If you don't understand that other beings have minds, that other beings can be negatively or positively affected, then you can't really be said to be a moral agent, because having agency implies awareness of harming or benefiting other beings. Now, one of the objections to the view that I just posed, that one can have higher order thought, namely metacognition, without mind reading, is in fact rejected by certain higher order thought theorists such as Carruthers or Evans, who maintain that metacognition does entail mind reading. So if non-human animals have higher order thoughts about their own mental states, then they must necessarily be capable of having such thoughts about the mental states of others. What is used to support the view that metacognition actually does entail mind reading is what is known as Evans' generality constraint. So this basically claims that if one has the concept of F, G, A, B, for instance, one must be able to combine the concepts and form the thoughts such as FA, GA, FB, GB. So keeping this in mind, consider that an animal is capable of the following three thoughts. I walk, the fox walks, I am in pain. It thus has the concept of I, fox, walk, and pain. So according to Evans' generality constraint, if the being, an animal, really possesses these concepts, it should be able to combine the concepts in the following way. I walk, the fox walks, I am in pain, and the fox is in pain. Thus the animal must be able to conceive of other subjects, such as foxes, as having different mental properties, such as the fox is in pain. A solution we can use in order to respond to Evans' generality constraint that maintains that actually one does have to have the capacity for mind reading in order to be conscious according to a higher order thought theory is to say, okay, well, let's say that is the standard for consciousness. That still then does not entail that non-human animals are moral agents, because there's one part of agency that's still missing that we haven't proved that non-human animals have, and that's moral thought, third order intentionality. But before we go on to showing that animals are lacking this, let's just talk about mind reading in general and how we might go about illustrating that non-human animals do in fact have the capacity to mind read. One of the examples that I talk about in my paper is the case of deception in animals. So intentional deceptive behavior in non-human animals, also known as the desire to produce a false belief, is said to be evidence of second-order intentionality. So deceptive behavior is said to be observed, for instance, in plover birds, who lure foxes towards them by pretending to have a broken wing in order to distract foxes from attacking their nest of eggs. Likewise, deception has been demonstrated in a female baboon when she pretends to forage in order to prevent an alpha male from discovering that she is engaging in a sexual act with a subordinate male. So these two examples are said to point to an animal's ability to attribute mental states to others and to form a higher order belief, desire, or thought about another's mental state. So plover birds, for example, as you can see in the picture, are said to desire to produce a false belief in the fox. What is this ability to have a desire to produce a false belief in another being enough to really claim that non-human animals are moral agents? That is, the answer is going to be no. We still haven't proved that there's third order intentionality, that is, a even higher belief about the rightness or wrongness of the desire to produce a false belief in another being, as you can see in the slide. This is kind of the picture in terms of philosophy of mind of what moral agency would look like if we're talking in terms of higher order thought. And it's not quite clear that animals do in fact possess this third order intentionality, a belief about rightness or wrongness, and we're going to talk about this in a little more detail in the next couple of slides about why that might be. Now, there are a number of interesting ways we could go about demonstrating that non-human animals do not have this capacity for moral thought, third order intentionality. But one of the ways that I'm going to focus on is whether or not non-human animals have the sort of moral concepts that are required for moral agency. So concepts are known as the building blocks of thought. They're attributed to non-human animals to illustrate their capacity for higher order thought. Yet, having higher order thought only requires the capacity to think in terms of simple concepts. The question then remains whether or not non-human animals can possess complex moral concepts, such as the concepts of right or wrong. So since having concepts requires that one recognize or discriminate different types of things, we must consider whether non-human animals can discriminate right actions from wrong actions. So Beckhoff and Pierce in their book Wild Justice point to the codes of conduct of certain species of animals that are said to demonstrate some sort of understanding of right and wrong. So in an example, they point to the rules concerning the training of cubs employed by coyotes. So if the cubs bite too hard, they are ostracized by the group and often end up having to leave entirely. Chimpanzees are also said to demonstrate a sense of justice by setting upon those in the group who deviate from their code. Yet one not need necessarily have a concept of right or wrong in adhering to the code of conduct employed by these groups of animals. One could simply adhere to these rules because it is the norm of the group. That is, animals can distinguish an action that violates their group's code and threatens cooperative behavior from one that does not. Yet this does not entail that animals understand these actions to be right or wrong in the moral sense that moral agents do. And this is the direction that Beckhoff and Pierce go in Wild Justice, is saying that, well, yes, animals have some sort of morality in that they're abiding by rules enforced by the norms of their group, but it's not full-blown moral agency because it's not independent of the norm. They're not using this universal standard to appeal to. Namely, we can explain their actions in terms of desires, so forth. And this is something that Searle goes into, where he argues that non-human animals can engage in and mean reasoning. They cannot have desire-independent reasons for actions. So the reason why they perform certain actions is because they're desiring to reach some end. But we can't take away that desire from these animals and then expect that they'll still act kind of impartially or according to moral standards like full-blown moral agents would. Even if non-human animals possess higher-order thought, they do not necessarily possess moral thought third-order intentionality, which is required for moral agency. That is, a moral thought or concept of the rightness or wrongness about a given desire has not been demonstrated in non-human animals, which thus requires us to suspend the judgment that non-human animals are morally responsible agents. As a consequence, non-human animals should be neither blamed nor praised for their actions. Thus, we should not only refrain from calling non-human animals bad or evil or sinners, but we should also suspend our common tendency to classify certain non-human animals as heroes or saints. Although this conclusion may seem obvious, we should stop and evaluate our tendency to characterize non-human animals in an anthropomorphic way in an attempt to ensure their moral considerability. That is, in attempting to demonstrate that non-human animals possess consciousness under a higher-order thought theory, we may be tempted to employ unnecessary tactics. A paradigm example of this good-intentioned anthropomorphism is the attempt of the Great Ape Project, led by Jane Goodall, to attribute legal rights to great apes and thus ensure that they are morally considered under the law based on the supposed fact that they meet the requirements of personhood. Although the protection of great apes from invasive medical research is a noteworthy goal of the Great Ape Project, what is overlooked is the potential consequence of such a view. If non-human animals are said to possess legal personhood and therefore legal rights due to their human-like intellectual and cognitive capacities, such as higher-order thought and a capacity for language, then it would seem that they should also be legally responsible for their actions according to the doctrine of mens rea. That is, if we grant legal rights to certain non-human animals based on their capacity for personhood, we might also commit ourselves to holding them accountable to the law and subjecting them to prison sentences if they attack, hurt, injure, or kill other animals. Do we really want to, by maintaining that non-human animals have the capacity for language or complex concepts, concede that animals are morally responsible agents, thus opening the door to cliches such as the claim that human beings are justified in eating meat or exploiting animals because they deserve such treatment, since they themselves knowingly kill, hurt, and injure others? If we can illustrate the capacity for higher-order thought in non-human animals without presupposing the capacity for language or sophisticated concepts, it seems unnecessary and even dangerous to focus on promoting the intelligence of certain non-human animals by pointing to their ability to form sophisticated concepts and to their ability to use language. Now I'd like to read a quote from Gary Francione that captures exactly what the motivation is with my project and urging animal ethicists to approach the demonstration of higher order thought in non-human animals in a cautious way. Begin quote. Instead of having humans at the top and all non-human animals on the bottom, we allow a few animals that are like us to come on over to our side. That leaves the vast majority of the other animals still on the bottom and without even a hope of moving up because they lack human-like characteristics. In other words, the campaign for ape personhood threatens to substitute one hierarchy for another, and I am concerned that we eradicate the notion of hierarchy altogether. End quote. Now, when applying Francione's insightful thoughts to higher-order thought theories, we can conclude that animal ethicists should, even when attempting to secure the moral considerability for non-human animals, remain willing to accept that although non-human animals may have higher-order thoughts, their higher-order thought is of an unsophisticated nature, before we too quickly assume that non-human animals possess these human-like sophisticated cognitive characteristics. That is, animal ethicists should pause and consider that it may very well be contrary and detrimental to the animal ethics vision to attribute sophisticated cognitive abilities to certain animals in order to demonstrate that non-human animals are morally considerable. Likewise, it is contrary to the goal of animal ethicists to too quickly point to the so-called sophisticated cognitive capacities of certain animals in order to demonstrate animal consciousness under a higher-order thought theory. Unsophisticated higher-order thought can be attributed to all animals, and it does not render them any less conscious or any less worthy of moral consideration. This is not to say that we should not investigate out of respect and wonder for animals their complex mental life. Yet we need not use these observations to ground a theory of animal consciousness or to ensure their moral considerability. Consciousness demands less even under a higher-order thought theory, and it would behoove the animal ethicists to recognize this, lest they risk denying consciousness or moral consideration to other, less sophisticated non-human animals. Thus, rather than try to meet the anthropocentric demands of Western morality that valorizes the rational and so-called humanly characteristics, animal ethicists should remain firm in pursuing an account of animal consciousness that does not aspire to demonstrate how much non-human animals are like human beings in their ability to use complex language or concepts. In closing, I would like to extend my gratitude to you for sitting through this presentation and hopefully offering some good, substantial feedback that can help to improve and create a better end product. I also invite you to read my paper, which goes into more detail than I've been able to in this presentation. I look forward to any suggestions and comments you may have to offer. Thank you, and enjoy Consciousness Online.